well, Paul may have said slaves obey your masters, but I can't follow that, and I can't agree with that because Jesus told me I have to see everything through love. And Paul admits that he sees through a mirror dimly, as well. Then maybe this is just Paul being like the people of God have always been and getting it wrong sometimes. And maybe it's okay to admit that, and we don't have to go through all sorts of weird mental gymnastics to reconcile that with the time period or cultural context. Maybe we can just say slavery is wrong because slavery is wrong, and Paul was a human being, and sometimes people get it wrong, and sometimes people get it wrong in the name of God, because that still happens today.
All right. Hey, everybody. This is Tom, Dr. Tom to some, Pastor Tom to some, Tom to many, and welcome to the Liminal Living podcast. This is a podcast for those in dark nights and deconstruction who are kind of in that your faith is dismantled and looking for just a new way of being in this world. And today on this podcast, I talked with author Zack Hunt, who wrote an amazing book called Godbreathed. That was one word. And it is about deconstructing the Bible and a fundamentalist understanding of it. And we go to some really interesting, fun, deep, raw, honest, great places today. So I think you are going to enjoy this conversation with Zack. And so without further ado, here we go. Let's dive in to deconstructing the Bible. All right. Well, Zack Hunt, welcome to the Liminal Living podcast. It's just a pleasure to have you. You're my very first person that I don't know. This is the first time I've ever met you in my entire life, was like 5 minutes ago. And I'm just really excited to have you here on the podcast.
I'm glad to be here and honored to be your first stranger on the podcast. Thank you for
Yeah, hopefully at the end we're not strangers.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you wrote this book called Godbreathed that I do want to get into, which is just such a helpful book for people who want to, understand the Bible from the non-fundamentalist aspect. And I want to get into that. But first, I'd like to kind of get to know you, and I'd like to know, like, what are your spiritual roots? Like, where did you come from?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I, like I say, I was born and raised in the buckle of the Bible Belt here in Nashville, Tennessee, where we produce, I think, most of the world's Bibles.
Oh, wow.
Or at least,
I didn't know that.
I think they get printed here, or at least like more than anywhere else. We're home to the Southern Baptist Convention, the United Methodist Church. It's several religious institutions. I went to one of them for college, but yeah, so I grew up in the Church of the Nazarene, which is an offshoot of the Methodism, not the United Methodist Church, because we started before there was a UMC. So anyway, it's complicated. We're Wesleyan. That's what I grew up in. It used to be a little bit bigger tent than I think it's becoming. That would include folks kind of on both ends of the spectrum, because the focus was not on a lot of the cultural battles that get fought today, but still I grew up conservative evangelical. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a loving home, fairly open-minded, for our into the ideological spectrum. So like I wasn't, I didn't have some of this stuff like shoved down my throat that some of my friends did, but I grew up believing in the rapture, worrying about the rapture, fearing that I've been left behind.
Oh yeah.
That was the subject of my first book, Unraptured. Shameless self-marketing plug right there.
Oh yeah.
But I grew up with those fears. Grew up only listening to Christian music. Grew up wanting to be a youth pastor. Went to college to do that. Had a kind of crisis of faith about the rapture and a bunch of other things, and went this way and that for a while, and ended up going back and doing some more graduate work. Found a job as a youth pastor. Was a youth pastor for several years. Then decided to go back to school again while my wife was in residency, and she was finishing her schooling. Thought I was going to be a professor, or I wanted to do PhD work. But after that second master's, I realized that I would much rather do popular writing than academic writing. Not popular in the sense that like people like it, but not in the academic sense. So So here I am, kind of working out my faith for the whole world to see on the internet and in books. Sorry, my dogs are getting antsy in the background. I will.
I love dogs.
I do too. They have quite the yelp in my house.
Oh, nice. What kind of dogs do you have?
So the two, one's a Bernedoodle. She is short, and a mini one, so she's like a foot and a half off the ground,
like a living teddy bear.
Yes, but like 3 feet wide. And then a Sheepadoodle who's a little taller and fluffier and has more energy than I thought any creature was possibly.
Those herder dogs.
Yeah, no, they're both sweet, but also can be loud, as they're choosing to be right now.
That's all right. I love dogs, so we can have dogs in the podcast. I got a Labradoodle, first generation, named Eleanor, and she's the sweetest. And then we just got Gilbert from the shelter, and we think Irish Wolfhound Doodle. We're not sure.
Oh,
yeah,
interesting.
Yeah, so I'll send you pictures later.
Very cool. Yeah, I'd like to see that.
What's really getting a lot of attention are the billboards that you purchased around Nashville. I've seen there's 3 of them, right?
Right.
So what do those say?
So they ran through this past Sunday, and there was 3 of them. The idea was to take some of the fundamentalism, that I'm critiquing in the book, some of those their own tactics and reappropriate them, and flip them upside down. It's growing up in the South, you drive up and down the interstate, and you see Jesus billboards, of all kinds, some more in your face, than others. And so the idea was to take that sort of tactic and make it more like hopeful, or at least more provocative. And so we end up with 3 messages that together I think really capture the book, and in sort of an intentional order. It's it's okay to admit when the Bible is wrong, and then I think that's how it was phrased. Sorry, I went to do a whole bunch of religions, and I can't keep them all track or all together. It's okay to admit when the Bible is wrong. God didn't write the Bible, people did, and then you're not going to hell. And so each one of those had a verse that is attached to it that kind of explains it, but really there was a web address underneath that further explained it, because with the first one with it's okay to admit when the Bible is wrong, and the verse is Paul talking about how we see through a mirror dimly. One with what God didn't write the Bible, people did, is just Romans 1:1, where Paul says, this is Paul writing this letter, and then that you are not going to hell, which has probably been the most I don't know, has gotten the most attention, but from people who are angry at the idea that people aren't going to hell, and then people especially agnostics and atheists who see it as good news, and that's John 3:17. God didn't come in the world to condemn the world.
So when was your, I guess I'll call it the oh shit moment, where like you're growing up in this conservative evangelical culture, and usually like there's like this moment where you're like, wait, this doesn't make any sense any longer. Things are falling apart. What was that moment like for you? Was it a thought? Was it a experience? Like, what was that?
Oh yeah, no, it was definitely a very specific moment. And it's in that first book, Unraptured. I showed up at college thinking that, I showed up wanting to be a youth pastor. And so to be a youth pastor, you take religion classes. And, in my head, it was going to be like AP Sunday school, and I was awesome and got, all the prizes and candy in Sunday school. So, this is going to be a cakewalk. I learned very quickly that, I was a bit in over my head. It was not AP Sunday school, and some of my thoughts that I assumed everybody agreed with, not everybody agreed with, including my professors. And so there's one day at the end of this first semester where I had a meeting set up with one of the New Testament professors who was my advisor, and we were supposed to, chart out the next semester, pick my courses, whatever. Before we did that, I sat down and I gave him like a 20-minute uninterrupted spiel about, my theories on the rapture, on the millennium, like when Jesus was going to return, why it was going to be a pre or post, who my candidates were for the Antichrist. And, I'd gotten all of this from a TV preacher named Jack Van Impe. And so I was like, Jack, you remember Jack?
I do. I grew up watching him with my dad.
But yeah, so I was really, really into him in high school. And I told him all about that and all the, evidence that Jack had given. And he said, I really respect, folks like him. They clearly love the Bible and the faith. He said, but, the problem is that they're trying to pinpoint places on a map that simply doesn't exist. He said, they're right that we are living in the end times, but we have been ever since Jesus walked out of the tomb. And that was a very definite fork in the road moment, for me, because I left angry, because I was embarrassed and I thought, this is going to be this big shiny moment where I can show off, and it was, me falling on my face. And so that really was the first thread, proverbial thread pulled on my faith, because it forced me to confront the possibility, not just that I had been wrong or could be wrong, but that I had been and could be wrong about things that I considered essential to my faith that were beyond questioning. And so, that just started a whole path of well, what else? What else could I be wrong about? And that's something that took course over years. That wasn't something that happened in a few weeks or a few months. It's still happening today.
I guess, who are the voices that guided you along the path that you see as like, these were the essential people that helped me kind of figure out this path from that moment there, where like Jack Van Impe, maybe he's not, like the Bible, all the way till now, like, who are the voices that guided you along the way that helped you?
For me, most of them are personal. I mean, as cliche as it sounds, my wife, has had a, outside influence on me, not just because she's my wife, but she was the first, real liberal and Yankee that I got to meet, because I, grew up conservative in the South, and she grew up liberal in Massachusetts. And so, seeing her and her family, be Christian in a way that I thought you couldn't be Christian, really forced me to open my mind, to new possibilities. Because her father, her parents are divorced. Her father is actually a monk. He took some vows several years ago, and he lives in a big Benedictine monastery. And so I'm like, this guy's more Christian than I am, and he's liberal. Like, how does that work?
How does this work?
Yeah. I mean, from a personal standpoint, then, my friend, Rachel Evans, her courage in writing, but also like, she was just such a great like supporter and encourager, like on a personal level, and so like that's helped shape me to try to be more as gracious, to others as she was to people like me. And then, obviously intellectually too, her writing and things like that. Yeah. And just a bunch of like random theologians and dead people from 2,000 years ago whose writings, that's the thing is, I mean, it's for me, there's that very definite starting point that I can point to where it kind of unraveled, but like the people, it had varied from, the famous to the anonymous, from professional theologians to classmates, whose names, no one will ever know, that have influenced me. Trying to think of if I could drop names. I should be able to rattle off book titles, but I'm not as good at promoting other people as I am myself.
That's all right. You're here to do that, actually. But man, well, I appreciate your voice, and you mentioned Rachel Evans, and she was such a courageous voice that we lost too early. And yeah, I'm going to be sad if we go down that road, but I'm glad that she helped shape my thinking as well. So we have a mutual friend in that one, but I never met her.
She's a great person.
It's funny, like the way that we were taught to use the Bible as conservative evangelicals was to like create like this personal self-sustaining empire, and then all of a sudden it's like, no, I need that voice and this person, and all these people come to help us along the way in like our journey of becoming, and that has really shines through in your book. So why did you say, I have to write this book? What was it that sparked that moment?
That's a good question. There are two reasons. One, like I said before, and I just keep repeating myself on, with this answers. This is me, working out my faith and in real time, working out my faith, not as I go. I mean, this is the culmination, of years of ministry and years of writing and years of spending time in the classroom and writing more papers than I can remember. And so it's, for me, it's part, personal confession of, and that's what my first book was, as well, of like admitting that I was wrong about how, I approached the Bible and the assumptions that I had about the Bible. And so as part of that, I hope I wanted to be permission for folks that need permission, like myself, that grew up being told, the Bible was off limits for, asking questions, like that it was just an answer book. You just do what it says and you go with it because it's plain and it's clear. And so, for folks that, are going through deconstruction or asking questions for the first time, I want them to come away from this book feeling free to doubt, to ask questions, to push back, to even disagree. That was something that maybe I got a taste of growing up. I certainly wasn't condemned outright, all the time. Definitely not by family, but it was always unspoken. Conservative evangelicalism, we're here because we have the right ideas, and those right ideas get us to heaven. So we can't question, those ideas. And so, I want people to be able to be free, and I want them to be able to follow that freedom, to follow the leading of the Spirit. I mean, the Spirit plays a huge role in the book. To feel free if Christianity is something that they still want to hold on to, and that there is a story in that book that's worth believing in, a story that's worth holding on to, and so if folks can still find a faith worth believing in, that's great. But ultimately, I just hope folks can come away from it with a healthier understanding of the Bible that is more intellectually honest, spiritually healthy, and ultimately life-giving, for the people that read it and those that we share it with.
Yeah. Well, as someone who read much of it, I say mission accomplished.
Thank you.
It is a really, I am a pastor. I preach every Sunday. We follow the lectionary calendar. And like this, like you really described like how I've learned to approach the Bible. You put words on it that there's just people say, like you preach differently. Like I've never heard that way before. And to me, it's like, well, it's just so clear. It's just right here. This is what it's saying. And it's like this book really like mapped out what made that difference in my own understanding and put words on it. And gosh, I would say if anyone just is deconstructing, having a problem with the Bible, like this is a really safe book to read, because you're not going to say, it's okay to question the Bible as long as you wrap around and come back to where you were. Like you really give people freedom and permission with this book. And I just think that's so important and beautiful. So thank you for writing it.
Thank you. That really means a lot. I mean, that was absolutely my goal. So to hear that it feels great. Thank you.
Well, jumping into the content of the book itself, I got some quotes here that were just like really good. And I want to talk about some of the content. But in chapter 1, you're talking about how we like mix up the Bible with God, and we're supposed to be worshiping God, but then because we mix up the Bible and God and make those two things like interchangeable, then we end up worshiping the Bible. And you really like build out something, a thought that I think is really important. You said when we make God and the Bible interchangeable, what we're also doing, albeit unintentionally, is making ourselves, or rather our interpretation of the Bible, interchangeable with God. That, I mean, nail, head, boom. Yes. The question is, what's the key difference between loving the scriptures and idolizing them and worshiping them? What's the difference there?
I think, what you're just talking about is the beginning of answering that question. I saw a tweet the other day that somebody had posted, and it started off great and was talking about, how Jesus is our lens for reading scripture. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. And then, it concluded with something, that way, like our personal perspectives or something else never gets in the way. And I just think that's fundamentally the wrong way to approach the Bible, because there's no escaping our personal interpretation and personal perspective and context. And the Bible doesn't ask us to do that. The danger comes in thinking that we ever could do that, because when we do that, and we pretend that we have excised ourselves from the act of interpretation, or the interpretation isn't needed at all, then what we had done is sanctified our decision-making ability and turned ourselves into, the arbiters of truth, and so we put ourselves in the place of God. And so, we kind of become like Thomas Jefferson, who famously chopped up the Bible and took out the miracles and things like that. And we do that as well. Not taking out the miracles, but chopping it up into creating and affirming, our preconceived ideas and things like that. Again, like, the issue isn't that we bring our particular perspectives and context. That can be excellent and important, and it's essential, which is why, we need a diversity of people reading and writing about the Bible, not just old white men or young white men. We need all sorts of people across every spectrum. But if we can't begin in a place, of honesty, a place of humility that recognizes, our inevitable role in the reading and interpretation of scripture, that's when we set ourselves up to turn the Bible into a weapon, because it ultimately ends up being about power and control. Because in that moment of delusion that we're not part of this process, we seek to control the process. I'm not doing this. This is God. Well, I'm really just trying to secure my salvation, because my salvation is based on right ideas. And if I tell myself, well, this isn't my idea, it's God's idea, then I feel all the more secure. And so, the very foundation of this book, I think, is just taking a moment for all of us, whatever end of the ideological spectrum you're on, to just be honest about the role that we all play, and how that's inevitable and not a bad thing, but could be a very good thing. But we have to acknowledge that.
Yeah. And you're pointing out something really important. I grew up in my teenage years, very formative years, my youth group years, was at a really conservative evangelical church that they even believed that like emotions were evil. Emotions were from like the devil, because logic and you can't mess with logic like you can't mess with math, right? Like you had to, like, subjective emotions were subjective. And if you had a subjective experience of God, then that is like liable for Satan to come in and mess with your mind, you weren't even allowed to like be emotional in church, right? Like be emotional about God, even given a testimony. Like it was just off the table. You're not allowed to do that, right? Like, and you're saying, no, this is actually important because we're human and the Bible is written by humans, and there's something still divine that's happening in the humanity of it. And you think we'd be comfortable with that because like the central dogma of the Christian faith is that God has become human and there is no separation between the divine and the human in Christ. And why can't the Bible also be divine and human. And that's a little bit more dangerous because we don't know how to control that one. Like I can control, if I just make it into a logical book of facts, I can control that. But as soon as you allow subjectivity and another perspective, I can't control that. And now it's dangerous. So we label it Satan and it's bad.
Exactly. I mean, you look how, look how the Bible opens with Adam and Eve snatching at control, trying to snatch at the divine of the tree of knowledge to control, their own lives more. And then you look in the writings of Paul in the earliest hymns of the church, he's reciting that same thing over again, almost as a reminder that, to follow Jesus in particular, but to be a follower of God is to give up control while still acknowledging, that we are in control of our lives. We make decisions and have responsibilities. But yeah, it's when we reduce the Christian life and salvation into a zero-sum game of me getting into heaven, then that control is everything because our souls depend on it.
Yeah.
But when that happens, then, there's no room for the Spirit to move. There's no room for the Spirit to breathe. Yeah. And if the Spirit is the source of life, then we end up, a valley of dry bones.
Mm. Now, you use the phrase, the Bible is the story of the people of God told by the people of God. Like you use that definition of the Bible quite a bit in the book. Why do you think that is so important that you repeat it like over and over again?
2 reasons, 3 reasons. One, it's really important to me, and you see this in the book, to establish, what the Bible is and what the Bible is not. And the Bible is not a book. It's a library, it's an anthology, it's a collection of things. And I think the story captures that better, than really even those other words, because there's an interconnectedness, they're not just haphazardly, brought together, there's intentionality. And then I like the image of a story because I think that the story is something that, or a story is something that transcends boundaries better than, a list of facts or a history. Like this isn't the history of the people of God because there's, not just because there's historical inaccuracies, but because there's lots of history that's not in there. This is the story. These are important moments. This is how we understand God's activity in our lives. And as a story, it's something that stretches beyond the boundaries of where it was written, but it also invites us to participate in it, I think, because I think it's an open-ended story. It's a story, it ends in Revelation, but Revelation ends way off in the future, right? In a weird sort of time sense, right? So the Bible itself closes Revelation, but all those events happen way off. So if that's true, if all these things at the end of the story happen way off in the future of our story, then we're part of this story. This thing is still us. And so then it becomes an invitation to, I think, to tell that story in new and fresh ways, just as the people of God have been doing for, thousands of years.
That's a really cool thought to see the Bible, like the dawning of humans with Adam and Eve, and then like the ending of time, and like those two, we're like in the middle and we're still within the story of the Bible. It's so easy to think the Bible was written for this past period of past peoples, and we're like, our lives are included in those two bookends. I never thought of it that way. That's really cool.
I'm going to be honest with you. I hadn't thought of it till just now, and I'm regretting not putting it in the book.
Oh, damn.
I'm like, hey, why didn't I put that in the book? So I'll be tweeting that almost immediately.
All right. That's awesome. Now, you said in chapter 2, when finding a meaning worthy of God is our guide for reading, interpreting, and implementing Scripture, so many of the ways we formerly use the Bible become non-starters, beating others over the head with clobber passage and damning them to hell because they don't agree with our interpretation, no matter how plain we might think it is not a meaning worthy of a loving God. It is not inspiring to anyone, and it is certainly not life-giving. It's the sort of calcification that destroys our spirit-breathed imagination and brings death to all who accidentally find themselves in our zealous wake. That's a longer quote that I had to just say all of it, because that's one, I loved your use of non-starter because it reminds me of Hamilton. And I love the musical Hamilton. And two, because it really just takes off the table like the anxiety around disagreeing with the Bible. Like, you just take it off and say that's totally not even worthy. And now this way that you were using the Bible, if you have a different purpose for it, those are just non-starters altogether. What inspired you to write that? What are you hoping that accomplishes in people's lives and hearts?
You asked before if there's about specific people. This is one of those specific people that's, influenced me, because this is Origen. Origen is one of the earliest church fathers. He's writing in the 4th century, I think. I'm going to embarrass myself.
That's all right. I don't know either.
I just wrote about him for like 2 or 3 chapters, and I should remember this. But Origen is a North African bishop from Alexandria. He ends up moving into, I guess, Palestine later on. But anyway, he's one of the most influential of the church fathers, the most influential, until Augustine, who comes about a generation or two later. And this is the idea that I found in Origen in his book on First Principles, and was really a freeing moment for me, because he just lays it out. It says, we should be searching, if we believe that this is a book of God, that it's divine, that this is a story about God, then we should try to find a meaning that's worthy of God, or worthy of the God that we find in that scriptures. And that God is a God of love, which means that if we're going to read this thing and use this thing, then we have to use it in a way that reflects a God who is love. And anything that doesn't do that is it's just a non-starter. And then Augustine picks this theme up as well when he says, any interpretation that you have, no matter how great you think your exegesis is or how many other proof texts or whatever, if it doesn't lead you to love God and neighbor, then you're wrong. And then, both of them, all they're doing is just, echoing Jesus, who says all the law and the prophets hang on this command to love. And so for me, all of reading that for the first time in grad school, reading, Origen, it was the first time, that someone had something that was so simple and so liberating, that allowed me to continue to hold on to this story that I still valued, and found meaning in, but do in a way that was honest and healthy. That just took things off the table immediately and said, well, Paul may have said slaves obey your masters, but I can't follow that, and I can't agree with that, because Jesus told me I have to see everything through love. And Paul admits that he sees through a mirror dimly, as well. Then maybe this is just Paul being like the people of God have always been, and getting it wrong sometimes. And maybe it's okay to admit that, and we don't have to go through all sorts of weird mental gymnastics to reconcile that with the time period or cultural context. Maybe we can just say slavery is wrong because slavery is wrong, and Paul was a human being, and sometimes people get it wrong, and sometimes people get it wrong in the name of God, because that still happens today all the time.
Wow. Yeah. And that, personally, I've been uncomfortable taking on Paul because of my upbringing in that very conservative church. It was like we interpreted Jesus through Paul, right. and we would take on all of Paul's epistles, and they were like, it was like Paulianity, not Christianity, and like and then if we did do Jesus, it was, like, well, here's what he said about lust and sex and money and right. hell, and nothing else was like, and everything was through the lens of Paul, and it was all centralized on Paul and his understanding. And like, you're just saying, we don't have to do that. Paul was just wrong, period, about slavery. Let's move on with our lives.
Right. And, and that was another one of those influences, around the same time with one of the professors. And this is, a story that I recount in the book, but, the long story short, it was just, he dropped this, for me, was a bombshell at the time. With, what if sometimes the Bible is just wrong? Not just in like scientific facts or historical accounts, but some of the things that it says are just morally wrong. Because if you read, take your child outside the camp and stone it to death if it's been, bratty, if you read that in any other context, you're gonna be like, that is no, like that's just wrong. That's deeply immoral. It's like, why do we feel the need to reconcile it in the Bible when the Bible is completely open and honest about how often the people of God do terrible things in the name of God? I mean, that's why the prophets exist, because the people had forsaken God. And it's the prophets continually talking about how they're doing all these idolatrous and terrible things, and false gods and whatnot.
Now, this kind of this idolatry of the Bible, setting it up as infallible. I mean, it is kind of an older thing to do because, Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake in 1600s for saying, that the Earth was not the center of the galaxy. It was burned at the stake. The Catholic Church didn't forgive Galileo, I think it was, until like 1995. And they finally said, we were wrong about Galileo, but we had good intentions. So there, yeah,
it's about the same time the Southern Baptist Church admitted they were wrong about slavery. But
oh wow, I didn't know that one.
No.
Man, it took a long time.
Say what?
That took a long time.
Yeah, it's enough to make you think that when they're telling you that the Bible is clear about homosexuality or anything else, women in ministry, maybe they're not the folks that are the experts on what the Bible is clear about. But,
yeah, like it takes us forever to admit when we were wrong, but then we even about slavery.
Yeah.
But like even something so scientifically factual as the sun is the center of our solar system, it took the Catholic Church 400 years to forgive Galileo. And like that's just weird to me. It should make us humble, but we don't ever give up the stance that we have of we are infallible beings because we have an infallible Bible. And so therefore, how we're now interpreting it is all correct. And then 100 years from now, we'll be apologizing for more things. You went into like the fundamentalist takeover in chapters 3 and 4. And, you talked about the fundamentalist response to Darwin. And you said the best way to ensure the Bible against another Darwin was to declare that it couldn't possibly be wrong about anything because it was perfect in every way. It wasn't just the story of the people of God. It was the very words of God himself. It was the inerrant, perfect in every way. And anyone who disagreed, anyone who had the gall to question its science, its history, its anthropology, its cosmology, or ethics was a heretic damned to hell. Like, that's powerful statement there. And your coverage of the history of fundamentalism was like so spot on and helpful. First, because, those of us who grew up thought it was like ordained by God, that this is the way. Yeah. And then you learn that, oh, wait, that's only 100 years old. Right. That's a helpful perspective. And second, like you uncovered a motivation of like building personal religious empires, much like, you said King James in his Bible did. And then the fundamentalists took over the SBC. And, they took over the Bible study market through all the publishers. And now the Republican Party is taken over by all these fundamentalists. Like, where is the exit ramp? How do we get out of this rampaging machine of fundamentalism, do you think?
It's a great question. I mean, it's a question that one of the pastors I mentioned, Emerson, in the book asked, I'm blanking, Harry Fosdick Emerson. asked 100 years ago in a sermon, "Shall the fundamentalist win?" And I think the clear answer is they did. And like you just said, I don't think you can really dispute that. They pulled the levers of power everywhere from the pulpit to the presidency, or at least, did, until, last election. But, I think, like you said a minute ago, it can't be overstated the importance of the publishing house, and the publishing industry and the influence that, is, it happens there. You like talked about in the book, you have fundamentalist seminary presidents teaching fundamentalist, preachers teaching, fundamentalist congregations, and they're all being undergirded by, fundamentalist publishing houses. I'll be honest, I don't know. I don't know how you break through that, because, like writing as like a progressive Christian author, there's a handful of, progressive or publishing houses that are even open, to some of this stuff. And then you've got big publishing houses that are consolidating, and that opens some doors. But, Harper One is a, large publisher. You've got to have a large following to do that. And so most of the other, publishers are great to work with, but are, massively, I don't know what the word is. It's hard to break through the hold of like Thomas Nelson and Zondervan. And not everything they're putting out, is bad or anything like that, but they're essentially the gatekeepers. Although I think they're now owned by the same company, which is kind of weird. But when the gatekeepers are just that, the gatekeepers, you try to kick down the gates, as much as possible. I think social media helps because it allows, people to have a voice that otherwise wouldn't. But yeah, I'll be honest, I wish I had an answer for that. I think it is the preeminent question of the church, in light of Trumpism, and in light of 81% of evangelicals, voting for that. Just in light of the state of the church in general, is that going to be the final note, or the final word, on American Christianity? I hope not. I think there's still good people doing things, but I think you're going to need new wineskins, for sure, to move forward. And I think you really have to take things down to the foundation. We're a people that believe in the resurrection and resurrection power, so we shouldn't fear the death of things that need to die.
Also, like, you look at how much power they hold, and yet you look at, the rapid decline of fundamentalist institutions like the SBC. They're like, they lost a lot of people last year, like more than 3 denominations combined. And do you think that, like, that consolidation of power and then the narrowing down of what is considered biblical and orthodox — I do biblical in air quotes, by the way, for listeners, through that fundamentalist takeover has anything to do with the shrinking numbers among young people?
Oh, I think absolutely. In my own denomination, is dealing with its own fundamentalist takeover, and we have pastors and what we call district superintendents and general superintendents, or essentially like bishops, convinced that like same-sex marriage is the greatest threat facing, the church and mankind. And it's just, and have decided that, the path forward is to double down and to swing right into fundamentalism. I can count on one hand how many people I graduated with from a Nazarene school and a Nazarene program designed to raise Nazarene pastors that are actually still in the Nazarene Church, because they're hell-bent on running off anyone under 40, or 50, and plenty of folks above that too, who, aren't convinced that Jesus, was a raging bigot who was focused on, same-sex marriage. And now I got on a rant and made it super personal.
I'm engaged. Keep ranting.
And so, there's that. There's the fact that the folks that are looking at coming into the ministry in our denomination don't want to, because like the things they're being asked to sign and to do are becoming more and more, inquisitional, more just absurd, more paranoid, by the day. And so, who's going to replace them? Like, because there may be good things going on and good churches going on. Like, I like to say that I go to a church, not a denomination, because I love my church and I'm really angry at my denomination at the moment. But the reality is, even if you have a nice church that's healthy in all the ways that churches should be healthy, those are the exception to the rule. I mean, anyone outside the church who has no like prior, connection, they're not hearing any good news. They're not seeing anything that they want to be a part of, a Bible worth reading or a faith worth following. And so, I mean, there's this fear over this lack of control. That's what the cultural wars are about, of trying to redo, life the way that, a lot of these baby boomers grew up. And, you're seeing the last dying grasp of that generation. And unfortunately, a lot of them are still in power and pulling the strings of politics and pulpits, and publishing houses.
Three Ps.
So the 3 Ps. I tell folks all the time, I grew up convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that being gay was a sin. And it took me a long time to get to the point where I could let the Spirit open my eyes and let the scales fall. And so there's definitely a lot of people, and I'm very hopeful that, a lot of folks, even my parents' age, that I see change their minds, and even older, that are being more open-minded. And that's great, because the reality is, that's Fox News can scream all they want about it, but that issue is over long-term in historical perspectives, in the sense, obviously it's not, there's daily battles, totally different for someone, who's not, but in the sense of the social consciousness, like my kids, my denomination can fight all they want, but my kids are going to grow up in a world where opposition to same-sex marriage is going to seem as backwards as opposition to interracial marriage is today. And so, we can fight impossible fights, or we can stop and say, maybe God is moving in ways that are outside of our control and in ways that we never thought possible. And maybe the Spirit is moving without us because we refuse to let the Spirit move. But again, that comes back to giving up control and being humble and doing a lot of things that are not in the church's strong suit very often.
I was listening to a podcast called Three Black Men, and it's 3 black men talking about theology, church-related issues, and their experience as black men. And they took on the topic of inerrancy from a perspective I had never thought of it this way before. But they said that inerrancy is like intertwined with white supremacy, because, being black men, they have a different experience of religious life, because just, being from the South and black, there's a whole history there, being persecuted by white Christians. And then there's inerrancy is the way that white people were able to hold on to control and power and say, it's okay that you interpret scriptures as long as the entryway into my world, you have to come into my world of inerrancy though. And I'm the one who gets to say what is true and what is not, what is right and what is not. And as long as you agree with me, you can come here. And that space is controlled by white men.
Yep.
And I had never, ever heard it that way before. And as you said, scales fallen from the eyes. And so I started to look into like Black liberation theology, reading people like James Cone and Howard Thurman. And it's just like, there is so much richness and diversity in their expression of like faithfulness to a religion that was persecuting them, and they're holding on to it in its essence while we've left it behind, claiming inerrancy. And I think that like your book is really dismantling not just the control systems of inerrancy, but like even I guess, indirectly taking on the white supremacy of inerrancy in that way. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. I think you're, right on. I mean, there's absolutely a plantation mentality, in this of like, here's the master and he has to be in absolute total control. And you see that, in broad strokes in, every kind of conservative evangelical church. But and when you get in those really hardcore fundamentalist churches, like an independent fundamentalist Baptist, which is its whole thing. I mean, it's quite literally, the male is the head of the household, and that means they control everything, down to what their spouses wear. So yeah, I was talking to pastor friends the other night, and so much of this white supremacy undergirds so many of the problems that the church in the United States is struggling with. And it's, when you realize that, it makes more sense to see those that have been particularly complicit, or those who just don't want to deal with tension, fight back so hard against quote unquote wokeism and, all these other, pejoratives that they toss around. When you see folks that feel like they're on when you see folks who feel, I'll get all my words out, like they're being either, unjustly attacked or exposed, they're going to come out, with pitchforks, screaming and yelling, and defending themselves. And I think that's what you're seeing, a lot, with the hard right swing of the church in the United States.
Yeah, I think so as well. Now you talk a little bit about the Bible as myth, and I was taught that myths were untrue stories proven wrong. We know that there's no character named Zeus. Well, actually, we just baptized Zeus and made him God the Father, but that's a different story. But you seem to be using that language for the Bible in a totally different way. Like the story of Adam and Eve is a myth. And you're not just saying, well, these are untrue stories, and now we know that evolution is true, Darwin was right. You're using the word myth in a richer way and in a positive way. So can you kind of explain, what you mean when you say some of these stories are myth?
Absolutely. This is an image or an idea that grew out of Unraptured, and looking at apocalyptic literature and trying to understand, the story of Revelation, the visions, because I had grown up as well with thinking that myth and truth were polar opposites, that if something was a myth, then it wasn't true, because myth was just a synonym for false or for fiction.
Right.
And so when I was faced with like the book of Revelation not being a literal account of the future, which, when you say it out loud should sound bizarre because it is, a bizarre idea, then you're left often thinking, okay, well, if it's not quote unquote true, or if it's not literal, then it's just false. And that's just not the case, because the Bible, like a lot of all ancient literature, embraces the power of myth, because myth, like historical accounts, are bound by context, by their, the moment in time, by the people who were involved, by the culture that was involved. But myths, can transcend space and time, transcend cultures, can transcend languages. That's why you see the myth of the Great Flood, in so many different religions, from Mesopotamia or in the Mesopotamian region. There probably was some great flood that sparked this story, but the truth was something that was universal. The truth the truth that was trying to be conveyed, was something that was universal. And that's what's so great. And I think why the stories of the Bible are in the Bible. And it's because, long before they were written down, they were just that. I mean, there were stories that people told to each other and around the campfire. And, when the people in exile are telling stories about Exodus, they can't prove that the Exodus happened. Archaeology didn't exist. They didn't have, the documents, but they had experienced that truth, of God's deliverance, of God's grace, of God's faithfulness. They had experienced that in their lives. And so that those stories, whether they're, historical facts or myth making on the part of writers, and whether it's in the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament. The reason those stories are in there is because we have seen their truth in our own lives. We have experienced their truth. And so that's the beauty of myth, and why I think the Bible continues to be resonant for so many people across so many cultures, thousands of years after it was written, is because its truth goes way beyond, facts and science and history. Its truth is something much, much deeper.
Mm-hmm. Now, that might scare people to say those words. Do you think that there's a way to tell which stories are myth, which stories are accounts of something that they were trying to explain actually happened? Noah's Ark, that one's pretty easy, but what about like Jesus walking on water, or the death of Ananias and Sapphira? Like, how can we tell, or even, is it even important to understand, to say these ones are myths over here, these ones are in the actual happened historical account category? Is that even important when it comes to the role of the Bible?
My goal with Godbreathed is to make space for people on both ends of that spectrum. People who answer yes to either one of those, questions. I believe that Jesus lived, died, and rose again. I also fully recognize that is a weird thing to believe. And I also recognize that there are people who look at the stories, as myth, but as myth thing, imparts and teaches really important truth. And so I don't think that it really matters ultimately whether you believe it's a factual literal history, whether you believe it's just a fabricated myth or something in between, because at the end of the day, being a follower of Jesus isn't about being a historian or a fact checker. Being a follower of Jesus is about loving your neighbor. And so what I try to get the book is, however you arrive at that, I don't think it matters. And I don't think it mattered to Jesus. Is the one time he talks about Judgment Day, when he's going to make this ultimate decision of decisions. It's not, did you affirm, the biblical story? Do you believe in the virgin birth? Do you think I literally walked on water? It's, I was hungry, did you feed me? I was thirsty, did you give me something to drink? And so, what I hope comes out of this, is more space, in the church, because I definitely grew up thinking, oh, well, you have to believe Jesus physically rose from the dead. Now, does that put you outside of Christian orthodoxy if you believe that Jesus didn't? Yeah, absolutely. But like, I don't really care as much about those things. Yeah. Like I think orthodoxy is important, in the sense of like, it gives us, a place to start. But, I'm convinced that, if Jesus is our starting point, and Jesus says that our starting point and our finish line has to be love, meaning that we have to understand that God is love, that God has tried to inspire a story of love, and that story should lead us to loving others, then I don't care really how you get there. And I don't know that God does either. And that opens the door to all sorts of cans of worms that I'm acutely aware of, like universalism and things like that.
Yeah.
But I just think God is bigger than any of us can imagine.
Yeah. Now, you said faith is great, but fundamentalism demands facts. And so belief in facts is baptized and reborn as faith. And I experienced that as a teenager, watching Jack Van Impe and watching like documentaries on, we found Noah's Ark, here it is, and here's the spot where they crossed the Red Sea, because here's all this Roman things under there, and here's scientific proof that we have lost one day, so the sun standing still moment actually happened. And it's like, you say God breathes scripture isn't a proof text for perfection, but an acknowledgement that scripture is inherently imperfect because it's written by God-breathed people. That inherently imperfect is just a gloriously heretical way to phrase it. I love it. And I use that in a positive sense. I think we need more boldness like this to challenge the consolidated authorities of the fundamentalists, because they are the minority when you look at, even though they're the gatekeepers, they're the minority when you look at just, how culture is shifting. You would think that like a faith who worships the incarnation of the divine and human in the form of Jesus would be like okay with its holy book reflecting that. Why are we not okay with that? Is it just the control thing?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's so much to lose from those in power. I mean, from just the very basic incomes and salaries to prestige and sense of self-worth and identity. There's so much to be gained and so much to be lost by admitting that the Bible is not perfect. Because, again, like if the Bible is perfect and I play no role in, well, I mean, I guess that's the irony of it, is if the Bible is perfect and I play no role, then why do we even need the pastors? Because we can all just, read it by ourselves. And that's sort of the idea of the Reformation. But the irony of the Reformation and their idea of sola scriptura is that everyone's idea of sola scriptura led to an immediate splintering into, dozens of different camps. Because sola scriptura is nonsense. And it was nonsense from the day Luther regurgitated out of his mouth. I'm not a big Luther fan.
He says some really hilarious things, and you're like, was he drunk when he wrote that?
I know he was constipated a lot, so that's how I try to say, okay, well, this stuff's terrible. It must have been a bad day in that department.
Yeah. You say in the context of the church, doubt and questions become sin, an affront to the clarity of Scripture, and a threat to the perfectly fortified walls of orthodoxy. Eternity and personal reputations depend on it. And then you go on to say, rather than standing ready with open arms to walk beside our brothers and sisters as they share their doubts and struggles and pain, too many in the church shout them down, kick them out, accuse them of maliciously leading others astray, or dismiss them as never having had faith at all. Now, in my pastoral experience of like 25 years now, and I feel really old saying that, but I've noticed that many in the church, like, they just pretend that they fit in. They wear their church face when they come in. They put on their church, it's almost like they're fighting in the car, and then they get to church. It's like everyone's smile and pretend everything's okay. It's like that one joke about taking a Baptist golfing with you. He'll drink all your beer, but if you take two Baptists golfing with you, they won't drink any because they don't want to be seen like drinking beer in front of the other one. Because we value this conformity and uniformity instead of unity and diversity. And I think that stance has like lost the younger generations. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. We've certainly made unity into an idol as well, and made it like the be all and end all to everything. And that's something which, and I know some people roll their eyes when I say this, but again, rooted in white supremacy. I mean, go read Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. Gosh. People ask if anything could be added to the Bible, I would add that in a heartbeat. I think it's outside the Bible, but like the most important thing white people in the United States could possibly read. And in it is exactly, what I think is going on with our idol of unity is we're more concerned with the absence of tension than the presence of justice. Which is why he says that, he's convinced that the greatest threat to the cause, of the Black community isn't the KKK or any of those things. It's just that it's the moderate white Christian who's more concerned with the absence of tension. And I think, that's what you see in unity. We don't want to face the difficult questions and conversations because confessing our sin is involved, and that's painful and awkward and embarrassing. But that's exactly who we profess to be, and who we're called to be. But by keeping people silent, you can keep women out of the pulpit, and you can maintain Jim Crow, and you can uphold slavery, and you can going on and on throughout history. That's the problem with turning unity into an idol. And it's also not super biblical. I mean, sure, you got Paul calling the early church to do that because you've got Christianity going off in 30 different directions from the word go. When Jesus walks out of the tomb, Jesus also talks about, I didn't come here to unite, but to divide. I came with a sword to separate, mother from father and blah, blah, blah. So you have to be very careful about that. I mean, there's absolutely something admirable about coming together and working together and that, but when we make unity an end of itself, then we have, a huge problem. And right along with that, this obsession that we have with like branding. And I think this comes from like the seeker sensitive movement in recent years, but branding is something as old as time, even if, it's just a modern obsession now. But, the medieval Catholic Church was, concerned with branding itself, leaders. But, we get so worried about people seeing our dirty laundry, that we're terrified that it will get turned into a, Hulu documentary or whatever. But like the Bible is, if nothing else, an account of the dirty laundry of the people of God. It's the story of murderers and rapists and adulterers and thieves and criminals and terrorists, and oppressors. And it's the story of God meeting all of those sorts of people right where they are. And, we are people who, if we're going to be calling ourselves biblical or scriptural, or if those words are going to have any meaning, then we're people whose story demands transparency, and accountability, not branding. And so I think as Christians, if we want to be, faithful to our calling and to ourselves and to our community, I mean, we have to do a much better job with transparency and being honest about when we screw up, because, especially in the social media age, you can't hide any of this stuff anymore. And, young folks, gosh, that feels weird to say, younger people, see through the BS, they see the hypocrisy and they want nothing to do with it,
Mm-hmm. Like I do a lot of like work with other pastors, where I spiritual direction and coaching and things like that through restoration, if they're burned out. And I'm noticing I know more ex-pastors than I knew pastors now, which is interesting in itself. But what I'm noticing is that there is an exhaustion in pastors because they're not feeling comfortable with where this thing is going, but they're also feeling fear of job security about saying something. And so we have like this imbalance where the pastors are supposed to be the ones discipling and shaping a congregation, but now instead we have the Republican Party and fundamentalists and the whole Trumpism thing is crazy. And so many of the pastors that I personally have interacted with, I haven't taken a poll or anything, are so uncomfortable with it. And I have heard the phrase, but I can't say anything to my congregation or I'll lose my job so often. Like, how do we balance that tension, do you think? Like what?
Ooh, I mean, you're talking about institutional change because, the reality is, as long as a pastor is bound to the whims of a local church board, it's impossible to be prophetic, because it's easy to stand from the sidelines and say, well, you should stand up for your principles, and you should stand up and speak. And in some sense, pastors absolutely should. If you're remaining silent during huge social upheaval moments like the Black Lives Matter, if you are just turning a blind eye to rabid, right-wing extremism, in church, like there is a point where you need to, or rabid homophobia, Islam, whatever. There is a point where you need to make some decisions. But to expect every pastor to be able to be in a position to just do that, the next news cycle, is not fair, not just to them, but to like their kids and their spouses who aren't pastors, And so it's difficult because it's such a two-edged sword. Because on one hand, you want pastors to, we think we hire pastors, to be prophetic, to speak for God, or in some sense, not directly, but however pastors, are supposed to communicate the good news to us. But then we completely negate their ability to do that by controlling the purse strings, and dangling, Damocles sword over their heads. Mm-hmm. Because if they disagree with the wrong people, those people will, get together and vote them out.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, there's institutional changes like an appointment system that can be helpful, but people go and complain to bishops, or bishops don't agree, and so they silence them. So, that's another one where I'll be honest, I don't know, but it is a serious problem that needs to be reckoned with. But I don't know that we have the courage to reckon with it, or honestly, the desire to reckon with it, because most of your churches that become huge because they're comfortable and make people happy. Yeah. And making people comfortable, happy is not prophetic.
Yeah, and I can grow a church easily by offering amenities. And I've heard young people say, well, I don't agree with this church, but they have a good kids program. And it's like, okay, but you're like perpetuating the system that's abusing you.
Exactly.
But it has the amenities, so. Okay, you said in like the final chapter, American Christianity in particular isn't just dying, it's already dead. The church, at least the church in the United States, is in desperate need of resurrection. And I think like not just American Christianity, but I think like Western colonial forms of Christianity are dying off or dead already. If you look at Europe, what does resurrection look like? What do you hope to see? Like if you could just wave a magic wand and everything's better again, like what would you hope to see?
Radical inclusivity, radical humility, and radical compassion for neighbor. I center my theology on the person of Jesus. That's why I hung around Christianity. It's because I find Jesus of Nazareth a compelling figure, someone worth following, as we said, at the beginning. And Jesus tells me to love my neighbor. Jesus loves his neighbor and says, go and do likewise. And Jesus says, at the end of all things, it comes down to how we love their neighbor. And I think it's easy to get to talk about getting back to like a radical simplicity of that. But it's harder because that sort of simplicity it's impossible to control. And we want to be able to control who people love and who they associate with and who's inside and who's outside. And it also will require a lot of confession and repentance for wasteful spending. I mean, think about how much money we pour into programming at churches. And like, if COVID taught us anything, it's that programming is irrelevant. I mean, you know what I mean? Like how many churches, are there churches that died because COVID, like, metaphorically, had to close their doors? Sure. But every single church that opened their doors after COVID is testimony that all that extra programming that we pour tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars into every year, that doesn't keep the church alive. So yeah, I think if I could wave a magic wand, it would be not getting back, because I hate the idea there was never some mystical moment in the history of the church, even at the very beginning, where everybody got along and was wonderful and happy. But if we could take Jesus seriously about loving God and loving neighbor being the beginning and end of the law and the prophets, and deal with the consequences in honest ways, I think that could be a radical transformation, or at least a step towards the sort of radical resurrection that I think the church needs.
Yeah. I think I have to say my favorite quote that you put in the book, I don't have a question around it, but I just need to say it, and thank you for using it. But you said, when we transform the Bible into a weapon of war against our enemies, in the end, they're not only the ones to suffer our wrath, we die too, as we're consumed by our sanctified hate and fear of the other. And that phrase, sanctified hate, is such a powerful and appropriate term. I just had to say that, get it on record here, and say thank you for saying it that way. It's true. Do you have any thoughts that go with that? That's just so powerful.
I hate that I see it so much every day, and I hate how welcome it has become in the church, and how afraid we are as a people collectively that we hate in the name of Jesus, and don't stop to think about the incongruity of that, because it's too painful, and that's very scary.
Yeah. So my final quote here that you kind of close things out: to be God-breathed is to tell a good story and a true story. So let us tell a good and true story, and let us tell it honestly, never being afraid to admit our failings, our doubts, our frustrations, our pain, our anger, our hope, and yes, even our ignorance. We were created to be free to be curious, free to doubt, free to ask questions, free to hope, free to love, free to disagree, free to deconstruct, and free to dismantle systems of injustice and oppression wherever they may be, including and especially inside the church. And I think that we all want this freedom. And, you know, when people get honest in church, and I try to make this safest space possible for people to be honest, people just like exhale, you know, like, oh, I can be me here, you know, and they want that freedom, but it's also scary because it is giving up the control. But there are people living in that liminal space of, I've stepped into that freedom, and it means that I had to step away from church because I can't find a place to exercise that freedom and be a part of a church. That's a liminal space in between of deconstruction and reconstruction and all that kind of stuff. What are some helpful, like, liminal living tips you have for those who have left the church because they couldn't find it there, but still wish to have some form of faith?
I think the most important thing would be to find community, because, I mean, ultimately that's what the church is about, because that's what God is about. You know, when we profess that God is triune, you know, that's not just some abstract theological, you know, puzzle that is just fun to think about. You know, it's a statement about who God is. We're saying that who God is fundamentally is this being in communion, this communion of love, and that there's not something behind that. That's not a description, you know, God, like, that's just who God is. And in saying that, we're saying that that image of a community of love informs everything. And if we're going to say that we are made in the image of God, then we are called to be creatures in communion with one another. And so, you know, I think that neither height nor depth nor, you know, principalities or powers or leaving the church can separate us from the love of God. And so I don't think we have anything to fear about leaving, you know, places that have been hurtful or painful or traumatic or whatever, because I don't think God's going to leave us. But I think at the same time, we need to remember that, you know, no man is an island, and that you can't just love it by yourself. You know, love is something that pours out, you know, something that's in relationship. And so I think, you know, when we step out of our tradition, you know, that we grew up in, into something healthier, that we always still do that in the sense of community, even just not for, you know, some secret religious reason, but just for our own mental health, you know, for our own happiness, you know, for our own fulfillment. You know, life is better shared at a table with other people, you know, than it is sitting alone.
Yeah. I know when I talk with people who have deconstructed, that is the thing that they miss the most, is they miss the people of the church and the sense of belonging and community and everything. Zach, thank you for writing this book. Thank you for your passion for the Bible that is so radical. And thank you for being on the podcast today. It's just been such a good time talking with you. If people want to buy the book, where would you prefer them buy it?
That's a great question. Wherever is easiest for them. It's such a loaded question. You know, I would be lying if I said I didn't get a bunch of books off of Amazon, but I love local bookstores, and I love my publisher, and every once in a while they have a deal. If you can check them out as well, that's Herald Press. But you know, whatever's easiest for people.
All right.
You can book just about anywhere online, except Lifeway. They won't sell it.
I wonder why.
I don't know. Weird.
Weird. And where can people, if they want to follow you and just kind of what you're saying in the public spheres, where's the best place to follow you?
Absolutely. I've got my most basic contact point is zackhunt.net. It's got most of my socials there. I've got a Substack, which is zackhunt.substack. And then my social handle is just a little bit different. There's an extra A because somebody stole my name a long time ago. But at Zack Hunt with 2 A's and Zack is on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Find me all those places. I've got some cool stuff going on at the website. You can find on Substack. You can find it. We're giving away a kintsugi bowl, which is, if you're familiar with that, it's a Japanese tradition of repairing broken pottery, in particular with gold. There's a whole story behind that. And if you're interested in having me come speak, I'm waiving speaking fees as I putting together a book tour for speaking. I promise I can speak good words. But there's stuff on the website there. You get me there and I'll speak for free. So lots of stuff. The book's been great. I appreciate you having me on. The response has been overwhelming and wonderful.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I can't wait to publish this one. I'm excited to dive in. Well, yes. I don't know how to officially end one. So I think I'll just hit stop.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us on the Liminal Living podcast today. If you are in a dark night or deconstruction and you need some help, some guidance, definitely check out Zack's book. I think it's a good way to see the Bible in a different light that's not so harmful to the soul. And I think it's the way to move forward. One of the pieces of how we move forward and rebuild this thing called the faith in a different world that is, it's all brand new. So if you're in the midst of a dark night in deconstruction, you'd like spiritual direction, just reach out to me through my Facebook page or on the website. Is on the way, still building it. Website's on the way. And we'd love to have you check those out. And I'd love to walk with you through those if need be. So peace out. We'll see you next week. We talk with author Jackie Turner. And she is the author of a book called Tumbled People, Deconstructing and Reconstructing Your Faith. So that's going to be a good one. Be on the lookout for that one. And we'll talk at you later. Peace out.